How does a kid from the tight, dusty alleys of Clara Town end up being the only African player to ever be named the best in the world? And then, even crazier, how does he walk away from the fame, the massive crowds, and the luxury of professional soccer to take on the super stressful, heavy job of running an entire country? Most people spend their whole lives trying to climb just one mountain to success. George Weah climbed two completely different ones. It makes you wonder, can you actually outrun where you came from? Or does the red dirt of your hometown always find a way to pull you back to where you started? George Weah didn't grow up with fancy soccer fields or expensive gear. He grew up in Clara Town, a neighborhood in Monrovia, Liberia, where the houses were huddled close together and the air was thick with the scent of the nearby ocean and the hum of a busy, struggling city. Life there was tough. You didn't have much, but you had your community. George was raised by his grandmother, who was the steady heartbeat of his life. She didn't have a lot of money to give him, but she gave him something much more important: a sense of pride. In those cramped, dusty streets, she taught him that your value doesn't come from what you own, but from how you treat people and how hard you work. Every day, George watched his parents and his grandmother navigate a world that didn't always make it easy to get ahead. They dealt with the kind of stress that comes from just trying to get by. Yet they carried themselves with a quiet dignity that George soaked up like a sponge. He spent his afternoons playing with other kids in the red clay dust. They didn't have a real soccer ball. They used bundles of rags tied together with plastic bags. If you've ever tried to kick a ball made of trash, you know it's unpredictable. It doesn't roll straight. It bounces in weird directions. But for George, that wasn't a problem. It was a teacher. He learned to watch the ball, react fast, and keep his balance no matter how bad the pitch was. He was just a kid in worn-out clothes, running through the heat with his friends. But he was already learning the most important lesson of his life. When you have nothing, you have to be creative. You have to find your own joy. And you have to be tough enough to keep going when the ground beneath your feet is uneven. He didn't know it then, but he was already training for the biggest stages in the world. Not in a fancy academy, but in the dusty, crowded heart of Clara Town. By the time George was a teenager, those rag balls weren't enough anymore. He had started to notice that when he played, the whole neighborhood would pause. People would stop what they were doing, selling goods, walking home from work, or chatting on their porches, just to watch him move. The pitch in Clara Town was anything but perfect. It was a chaotic mix of dirt, sharp rocks, and tight spaces between houses. If you weren't quick, you'd run right into a wall. But George, he turned those obstacles into his personal playground. This is where he learned to read the game. Because he played in such small, crowded spots, he couldn't just kick the ball and run. He had to learn how to weave through defenders, how to keep the ball glued to his feet, and most importantly, how to stay calm when 3 or 4 older, stronger kids were rushing him at once. He developed this rhythm, a mix of fast, dirty movement and patient, quiet moments where he'd wait for the perfect second to strike. Think about it like this. If you're playing a video game on the hardest setting, you learn to spot patterns, right? George did the same with soccer. He learned that every defender has a weak spot and every game has a pulse. He wasn't just kicking a ball. He was solving a puzzle. His peers began to see him not just as the kid from down the street, but as a local legend in the making. He started playing for smaller youth teams. And that's when he realized he had something extra. When he was on the field, the stress of home, the lack of money, and the struggles of life in Monrovia just disappeared. It was just him, the ball, and the goal. He didn't have a coach teaching him fancy tactics or high-tech equipment. His teachers were the jagged edges of the street and the pressure of the game itself. He was learning how to be fearless. He realized that if he could master the ball in the dusty, uneven heat of Liberia, he could probably master it anywhere. He was starting to dream bigger than Clara Town. The question wasn't if he was good enough. The question was, who would be the first person to notice that this kid wasn't just playing a game? He was writing his own ticket out. By the time he was in his late teens, George Weah realized that to test how far his talent could truly go, he had to leave the comfort of the familiar. He started making a name for himself with local Liberian clubs like Mighty Barrel and, later, the Invincible 11. Imagine the scene. He's playing in the Liberian Premier League, dominating the field and scoring goals at a rate that made people stop and stare. He was becoming a big fish in a small pond. But he knew that if he wanted to reach the next level, he needed to find bigger water. His journey out of Liberia didn't happen overnight. It was a series of brave leaps into the unknown. First, he moved to Ivory Coast. And then, in 1987, he made the move that would change everything. He signed with Tonnerre Yaoundé in Cameroon. This was a massive shift. He was in a new country, speaking a different language, and playing against tougher, more seasoned professionals. But if you've ever moved to a new school or a new city, you know that mix of fear and excitement. That feeling of wanting to prove yourself to people who have no idea who you are. George thrived on it. He didn't just fit in. He exploded onto the scene. In just 18 games for Tonnerre, he scored 14 goals. It was like he was playing a different sport than everyone else. His speed was lightning, and his ability to see the game, to know exactly where the ball would land before it got there, was becoming legendary. Word of this phenomenon started to spread. Eventually, his talent caught the eye of Claude Leroy, the manager of the Cameroon national team. Leroy saw something in George that most people missed. He didn't just have skill. He had a hunger that couldn't be satisfied. Leroy reached out to Arsène Wenger, who was then managing AS Monaco in France. Wenger, a man known for spotting diamonds in the rough, flew all the way to Africa to see this kid for himself. He watched George play. And in that moment, the bridge between the red dust of Monrovia and the bright, manicured stadiums of Europe was built. George Weah was about to step onto a plane that would take him thousands of miles away from everything he knew. He was leaving the safety of home, the friends he grew up with, and the streets where he first learned to kick a ragdoll. He was heading to France, a land of professional contracts, high-tech training, and pressure like he'd never felt before. He was just a young man with a pair of boots and a massive dream, about to become the first of his kind to show the world that a boy from an African slum could stand toe-to-toe with the best in the world. When George stepped off the plane in France, it wasn't just the climate that hit him. It was the weight of expectations. Imagine moving from a neighborhood where everyone knows your name to a country where you're just another new guy trying to prove you belong. The stadiums in Europe were massive. The grass was perfectly cut. And the defenders were faster, stronger, and more tactical than anything he had ever faced in Liberia or Cameroon. At first, it wasn't easy. The pace of French football was intense. There were days when the cold of the European winter seemed to seep right into his bones, making it hard to find that rhythm he had perfected back in the heat of Clara Town. But George had a secret weapon. He never stopped believing that he belonged on that field. He treated every practice like a championship final and every game like a chance to represent everyone back home who would never get the opportunity he had. Slowly, the world began to notice. He moved from Monaco to Paris Saint-Germain, PSG. And that's when he truly became a global star. He wasn't just a player. He was an artist. He would take the ball from his own half, sprint past 4 or 5 defenders, and score with a grace that made the toughest crowds in Europe stand up and applaud. Then came 1995. This was the year George Weah stood at the very top of the mountain. He was named the FIFA World Player of the Year, the Ballon d'Or winner, and the African Footballer of the Year, all in one season. Picture him holding those trophies. He was the first, and still the only, African player to ever be crowned the absolute best in the world. But here is the most important part. Even when he was surrounded by cameras, fame, and millions of fans, his heart was still in Liberia. Back home, the country was going through a brutal civil war. While he was scoring goals for AC Milan in Italy, he was constantly sending money, supplies, and messages of hope to his people. He had made it. But he didn't use his success to hide from his past. He used it as a spotlight. He showed the world that a kid from the slums wasn't just capable of succeeding. He was capable of changing the world's perception of where talent could come from. He wasn't just playing for AC Milan anymore. He was playing for every kid who was still kicking a rag ball in the dirt, wondering if they would ever get a chance. He was the king of Milan. But he was also the boy from Clara Town. And he never let the world forget it. When George officially hung up his boots in 2003, most athletes might have headed to a beach or a TV studio to talk about the game. But George didn't retire to sit still. He looked at his home country, Liberia, which was still trying to heal from years of brutal civil war. And he realized that his biggest match hadn't even started yet. He didn't just want to be a guy who scored goals. He wanted to be the guy who helped score a future for his people. The move into politics wasn't easy. And frankly, a lot of people told him he shouldn't do it. They said, "George, you're a footballer, not a politician. Stay in your lane." They criticized his lack of a college degree and doubted that someone who spent his life on a pitch could handle the messy, complicated world of government. But George had faced tough defenders his whole life. He was used to people trying to block his path. He decided to do the hard work. He went back to school. He earned his high school diploma at age 40. And then pushed through college and grad school to get the education he needed. It was a humble, gritty move. It showed that he wasn't just relying on his fame. He was willing to start over as a student to prove he was serious. He formed a political party, the Congress for Democratic Change, CDC, and started hitting the campaign trail. He didn't speak like a stiff, traditional politician. He spoke like someone who had lived in Clara Town. When he stood on a stage, the youth, who made up a huge part of the population, didn't see a distant leader. They saw someone who had walked their same streets. They saw the boy who made it. He lost his first few elections. And those defeats were painful. He could have easily walked away and stayed a comfortable, retired legend. But he kept showing up. He became a senator in 2014, learning how the system worked from the inside. He was building a bridge. On one side was his life as a global icon. On the other was the reality of a country struggling to find its footing. He wasn't just trying to win an election. He was trying to use the clout he'd earned on the world stage to turn the page on Liberia's history. He was showing everyone that you don't have to let other people define what you are capable of, even if they tell you that you don't belong in the room. In 2017, the moment finally arrived. After years of being told he was just an athlete and not a leader, George Weah stood before the people of Liberia as a candidate for the highest office in the land. When the votes were counted, the result was clear. The boy who once played with a bag of rags in the dirt had been elected the 25th president of Liberia. It was a historic moment, not just for Liberia, but for the entire world. It was the first time in over 70 years that Liberia was seeing a democratic transfer of power from one elected leader to another. But winning the election was the easy part. The actual job of being president was a totally different game. Imagine trying to steer a ship through a massive storm. That's what it was like for George. He inherited a country with deep-rooted problems, a struggling economy, limited jobs for the youth, and schools and hospitals that desperately needed repair. The roar of the stadium crowds was replaced by the constant, heavy pressure of a nation's expectations. Every decision he made touched the lives of millions of people who were looking to him for a miracle. Being president didn't come with a playbook. He wasn't playing against 11 guys on a pitch anymore. He was working with global leaders, trying to attract businesses, and figuring out how to build roads and infrastructure that would last for decades. Some days were filled with progress, and other days were met with criticism from people who wanted to see faster change. He learned quickly that in politics, you can't win by just dribbling around your opponent. You have to work as a team, and sometimes, you have to make hard choices that not everyone will agree with. Yet, throughout his time in office, he kept one thing in mind: his origins. He famously kept his focus on building infrastructure, roads and schools, in places that had been neglected for years. He wanted to make sure that the kids growing up in Clara Town today wouldn't have the same struggles he had. He was no longer King George on the pitch, he was Mr. President in the capital. And though his time in office was filled with both victories and heavy challenges, his presidency proved one final, powerful point: the person who reaches the top of the world doesn't have to forget where they started. In fact, that starting point was exactly what drove him to try to lead. When we look at the life of George Weah, it's easy to get distracted by the highlights. The Ballon d'Or trophy, the presidential sash, and the cheering crowds. But the real story of George Weah isn't about the prizes he collected. It's about the journey he chose to take. He started as a kid in the red dust of Clara Town, learning that you can create something beautiful even when you have almost nothing. He took that lesson to the biggest stages in Europe, showing the world that talent doesn't have an address. And that a rags to riches story isn't just a movie plot. It's something you can live if you have enough grit. But his greatest move wasn't a goal. It was his decision to come home. Many people reach the top and choose to stay there, safely tucked away from the problems they left behind. George did the opposite. He walked away from the luxury of his life as a global superstar, to step into the mess, the criticism, and the hard work of trying to build a country. George Weah's life is a masterclass in staying connected to your roots. He proved that no matter how high you climb, the most important work is often done right where you started. He showed us that success isn't just about winning. It's about what you do with the power you've earned. So, here is the takeaway for the next generation. You don't need the perfect gear, the perfect school, or the perfect start to make an impact. You just need to realize that the skills you learn in the hardest part of your life, resilience, creativity, and the ability to keep moving forward when the ground is uneven, are the exact same skills you need to change the world. The final whistle on his presidency might have blown. But the story of the boy from Clara Town isn't finished. It lives on in every kid who looks at a bundle of rags, kicks it, and dares to imagine a world where they belong at the very top. Thank you for staying this far with us. This is the African Archive. If this story matters to you, subscribe and join us as we uncover the next chapter of Africa's remarkable past. The archive is never closed. We'll see you in the next story.